My name is Ziad Munson. I am an associate professor of sociology in the sociology and anthropology department. I'm also chair of the sociology department, the sociology and anthropology department. And last but not least, I teach a class called Calling Bullshit, which will be offered again in the spring. And David, who organized this session, actually took that class, which is probably why he reached out to me today. I hope you've all voted. Can you give me a thumbs up reaction if you've voted already today? Who else? I only see one here. Your time is much better served voting than listening to me. Okay, so we've got a couple of people with thumbs up. So I want to talk today about, if I can get my thing working here, attacking bullshit in the media. And really, I've got sort of 5 things I want to do. I want to talk a little bit about how we think about bias. I want to talk a little bit about some like what the goals of bullshit in the media are, some strategies for identifying it, some strategies for combating it, and then finally leave you with some some other materials if this interests you and you want to look into some more detail. So with that, let me just start with what I said first. Sort of, what does bias mean? I'm sure you've all heard this term, sort of, this news item is biased, or the media is biased, or my friend has a biased point of view, or what have you. Can someone or multiple people, what does that mean to you? What does it mean to say someone is biased? Go ahead. We don't have that many people here, so you can go ahead and just speak up. Silence. If you don't want to speak up, you could also just write it in the chat. But we won't have much to talk about here today if no one has even a starting point on what we mean about bias. All right, so John shared in the chat support one way or another on a point. It's a fair, very, very common way of understanding it. How about some others here? Gary says having an opinion on a subject before getting the facts. Yeah, I want to get to that. That's a good point. Christian says an inability to acknowledge other people's perspectives. Another way we sometimes look at bias. Good. Any of the others of you? We've got a few more people here in the group. All right, well, I mean, let me say this. I mean, one of the problems with talking about bullshit in the media is we have come to equate bullshit with bias, and we've come to equate bias with having an opinion. And none of those things are actually the same thing. And I think that that's a sort of really important starting point. And the starting point is this: you can have an opinion without being biased. One can have a perspective and not have that be a biased perspective. So just because it is a point of view or an opinion doesn't in itself make it bias. I think that really what you want when we're talking about bias, what we really want to talk about is not having a point of view, but when you're biased when you give undue or unfair credit to information, right? Like this data is more important and you're not looking at this data, or to one side of an argument, which is what John had said, right? So it's fine to have it's fine to have a point, right? A point of view. That's not the question, right? The question is whether or not that point of view gives undue or unfair credit to information on one side of the argument or another. And so just to give you a concrete example, today it is the presidential election. Because one presidential candidate or another says something doesn't mean the thing that they said or the fact that they gave is biased. It might be, but it doesn't necessarily mean it, even though each candidate clearly has a point of view. The question of whether or not something is biased really boils down to whether or not the credit is undue, the focus is unfair in one way or another. And I think we can, we each have lots of sort of examples of that kind of thing. So that's a sort of starting point. And the reason that's important is because we have sort of tuned our brains in many ways to tune out a lot of information because we think of it as biased. And by biased, we mean it just has a sort of point of view. And the problem with that is then we all run around with empty brains because everyone has a perspective, everyone has a point of view. And if we're turning our brains off, if we're not processing that information, if we're not looking into that information, then we are ignorant and we're operating with sort of really no information at all. So it is important to make that distinction, which, can be hard at times, but the distinction between having an opinion and being biased. These really are two different things. Okay, so with that, let's talk then a little bit more about bullshit. So one question to sort of start with is sort of what is the goal? Like, what is the goal of bullshit? And really, we don't really want to talk about bullshit. We probably talk about bullshitters, right? When someone feeds you BS, why do they do it? What's the goal? Not a rhetorical question. What do you think? You've all heard BS. We're awash in BS. So someone share some of the reasons that we hear BS. All right, John, thank you for piping in to get you to view things the way they do, right? So, I mean, in some ways, your point, John, is a common one, right? Right? We bullshit people to convince them, right? We're trying to be convincing, and that's kind of the same sort of basic punchline behind the example that Gary gave, which is also a great example. It's something that's untrue, that's intended to make you believe. I want to talk a little bit about that issue of being untrue. Not all BS is untrue, although it's, there's other ways in which something can be BS. Without it actually being untrue. But I take your point, right? Which is the motivation or the intention is to make you believe something. Maybe it's to change your mind. Maybe it's to form your opinion in one way or another. And I think that that's actually a really common old school way of looking at BS. And it's what BS looks like a lot of the time, or most of the time, right? They are things that are untrue, or they're exaggerations, or they're things taken out of context. And the reason that all of those things are done is because there's an intention to persuade, there's an intention to convince, or maybe there's an intention to hide or cover up or something, right? And so it's about sort of trying to kind of tip the balance of the scales one way or the other by misrepresenting some facts or by saying lots. I mean, the other kind of BS you hear a lot in colleges and in universities is like lots of flowery language or lots of writing that is super complicated and uses super big words, but really doesn't say anything, right? It's just sort of complete emptiness. And there the BS is trying to convince you that the person is smart or trying to convince you that the person has something to say when in fact they don't have anything to say at all. Okay, so that kind of BS we know, but there is another kind of BS that is, I think, the far more dangerous kind of BS, and it's the BS that we've seen much more of in recent years, particularly in our political life, but it's also seeped into advertising, sort of cultural expressions and so forth as well. And that is BS that's not actually designed necessarily to persuade you. It's simply designed to lead you to question any kind of information that you're getting, right? So I make this distinction between normal bullshit and extraordinary bullshit, right? So normal bullshit is the bullshit, is the sort of definitions that you, Gary, and Christian and so forth provided. That's the everyday bullshit. Extraordinary bullshit is defined, number one, right? It tends to be more untrue than normal. It isn't just that it's an exaggeration. It isn't just that you've changed the way the graph looks to sort of hide something or show something. It can often just be an outright fabrication, right? It can be like you make up the data, right? Or you just change the graph. So, normal, regular kind of BS doesn't usually take on that sort of obvious, direct lying. Number two, it happens far more frequently, right? So in a normal presidential campaign with a normal presidential candidate, you have the candidates and their surrogates and the people that they that support them, that they'll stretch the truth on certain issues. They'll focus on one thing rather than another to try to put your attention here. But they're not actually doing this all the time, right? And in fact, until just a few years ago, when candidates cross that line, there could be a major scandal, right? And people would be talking about it for a long time. Now, those kinds of lies are happening. So not only are the lies so extreme, but they're happening so often that they're not really even covered anymore. And this is perhaps one of the things that motivated some of you to come participate in this session, is sort of the realization that, like, how do we deal with this extraordinary kind of BS that is just so frequent. And then the other thing that's different about the goals of this kind of BS is the goal isn't to persuade you, right? The goal isn't to persuade you. It is instead, the goal is to confuse you, to make you disbelieve that there's anything that is true, to make you think that it's too much work, or to find out the truth, or to make you think that everything is biased, right? That, well, there's this perspective, everyone has a perspective, and it's just a matter of choosing one or the other. And this is the most dangerous kind of BS. It's the thing that worries me the most. And this is not the first time in history that it has come up. It's not the first time in history that people have talked about this. Hannah Arendt was a political philosopher. Her origins were she was a German Jew. She fled as a refugee to the United States from Nazi Germany. And in 1951, just a few years after World War II, she wrote a book called The Origins of Totalitarianism. And her purpose in that book, right, is to try to retrospectively go back and look at how did the rise of Nazism happen? What is it about the way in which the Nazis rose to power, which probably all of you know by now, the Nazi Party in Germany rose to power in a democratic system. They were, Adolf Hitler was at first elected as the Chancellor of Germany. And she wanted to understand how a totalitarian system could take over and destroy a democracy that has millions of people in it. And one of her main answers, right, is that this type of bullshit is developed, right? Not a bullshit that's designed to persuade you, but bullshit that's designed to confuse you, to turn you off, to make you think that there is no truth at all that you can really find. And I wanted to give you, hold on here, a sort of quote. It's too big to put on the screen, but I'm going to put it in the chat here. And this is just one of many quotes that are relevant to this particular issue of bullshit from The Origins of Totalitarianism. Arendt says, the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist. That is, it's not bullshit that makes you, that converts you, that persuades you. But the subject of totalitarian rule is the people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, right, the reality of experience and the distinction between true and false, is the standards of thoughts no longer exist. So bullshit at its worst, right, is tearing down, right, the distinction between fact and fiction. And this really is the goal of extraordinary bullshit. And it is the goal of the kinds of bullshit that we often see today in politics, in advertising, in the ways in which PR firms try to manage the image of corporations and corporate action, and in a wide variety of other places. Oh, but I realized I didn't actually send you the quote. So there it is in the chat. I read it to you, but didn't hit return. So that's the goal of bullshit. Now, I think, if you read the description of this session, there was sort of a promise to kind of get into the nuts and bolts. I've been giving you some sort of big picture things here, but it's worth also talking about like how can you know if you're being bullshitted or not. Now, we are bullshitted all the time, all of us, and so we all have some sort of techniques already. So I want to hear what you do. How do you recognize BS when you see it? Yes, John, you're right. As you said in the chat, sometimes bullshit is hard to recognize, and I know that's why you're here. I am going to give you a few tips, but I don't want to. I'm not going to waste my time on tips that people already know. And some basic ones. So tell me the ones you use, right? Like, you're on social media, you see the news from time to time. Your friends tell you things that you know aren't true. Like, how do you recognize that? All right, so Gary says something that doesn't sound quite right. I like that. I mean, the truth is, I call that the sniff test, right? If if something doesn't sound quite right, it probably isn't quite right. And I think that's a good measure. Or if you know that something is true, Gary, and you hear something that contradicts it, that's at least a reason to give you pause, right? You shouldn't reject new information that contradicts what you already know automatically, because it could be what you know already is actually BS. But if you see that contradiction, you definitely want to give it a higher level of scrutiny. Gary also mentioned sometimes it's just how emphatic facts are delivered. There is, I think I agree, right? There's a kind of a stylistic piece here. If someone just sort of is really in your face, and tells you their facts like this and says, this is true and this is true and this is true. Well, I mean, it seems like that person's emotions have overtaken them, and perhaps they're speaking from an emotional place and one where you might want to check some of those facts. John mentions that anonymous sources are a warning sign. I agree. I mean, there's very particular situations where anonymous sources can be useful, but I think that the issue of sources in general is a good one, right? I mean, one of the things that you learn as a college student is you need to check your sources, know who is speaking, where does this quote come from, why are they qualified as a source to provide this information, and so forth. All of those are actually really great foundational ways of identifying bullshit. And so, I'm glad that you're already looking at those things. Christian mentions cross-referencing statistics. Yes, absolutely. Don't take things for face value. When someone says something to you, go and look it up from other sources as well, right? That's what we mean by cross-referencing. Journalists use this all the time. Responsible journalists don't report information on one source, right? They want to also verify that information by obtaining it from another source that's independent of this source, right? So that it comes in different ways. And I think that that's really important. So these are some sort of regular ways, but not by regular, I don't mean to be dismissive. I think these are actually really important ways. Let me give you some additional ways that you might consider. There's many, many more, but just sort of as food for thought. there's a couple of ways to identify bullshit. The first one is Occam's razor. Sort of give me a clap in a reaction if you've heard of Occam's razor before. Has anyone heard of Occam's razor? Are you all busily Googling it now? No one's heard of Occam's razor. Gary's heard of Occam's razor. Yay! All right. So Occam's razor is this is an idea that all else being equal, the simpler explanation or the simpler theory is probably the better one. Now, why that's important is that we're living in a world right now where the particular form that a lot of the extraordinary BS that we have to deal with comes in is in the form of conspiracy theories, right? Elaborate theories about what's going on in the world that if you took even a few seconds, you would recognize that they can't possibly be true. And Occam's razor, this principle that all else being equal, the simpler explanation is probably the better one, really helps cut through these conspiracy theories, right? So I think that the theory now that the biggest kind of, it's not just a conspiracy, it's a whole sort of conspiratorial movement known as QAnon. Their sort of root conspiracy from which they spin all kinds of stories is that there is a national or international pedophile and sex trafficking ring that is operated through the deep state of the United States, and Obama and Hillary Clinton and other sort of prominent Democrats are a part of this sex trafficking ring, and Donald Trump is a sort of savior figure who is trying to root out all of this abuse and the killing and enslavement of children and so forth. Now, let me just be absolutely clear. I mean, one way to call bullshit on this is all the ways you've already described. What are the sources? Ask for evidence, right? There's not a single scintilla of evidence in favor of this conspiracy theory or that would lend credence to such a conspiracy theory. But Occam's razor is really useful as well, right? If you stop for a minute and look at the kind of rantings of those who have adopted this conspiracy theory, which, by the way, includes several people running for Congress who are likely to win congressional seats today in the election, who are followers and believers in the QAnon conspiracy theory. But if you stop to listen to these rantings, right, then you start to realize that the number of things that have to be true are extraordinary. And the things that have to be true are complex, right, and difficult to maintain. And they all have to mesh in a very particular way for any of it to be true, right? It's an extraordinarily complicated explanation for how the world is set up right now. A far simpler explanation is that there isn't as much sex trafficking by the federal government as QAnon would suggest, that those who are the political opponents of President Trump are not, in fact, connected to one another in an enormous conspiracy to abuse and in some cases ritually kill young children and so forth. And so in this case, all else being equal, the simpler explanation is probably the correct one. You'll notice that I always preface the simpler explanation is the better one with this point that all else being equal. Right, the world is a complex place. Conspiracies sometimes are true. So this is a sort of heuristic in the same way that checking your sources is a heuristic. It doesn't eliminate all BS all the time, but Occam's razor is a really useful way of sort of listening to your friend, or listening to your uncle at Thanksgiving, or listening to what you're hearing on Fox News, or listening to whatever is being said in that TikTok video and saying, could that be true? For that to be true, there would have to be all of these sort of complicated interrelationships and inner workings. Occam's razor tells us that that's probably not true. And my experience is that Occam's razor really does a good job in helping root out a lot of bullshit that we hear in the media. Okay, so Occam's razor, the other kind of main, I don't know, heuristic or tool that I think that is really useful for identifying bullshit in the media is the dodge. The dodge, everyone knows what the dodge is, right? Anyone who listened to the vice presidential debate a few weeks ago between Kamala Harris and Vice President Mike Pence knows the dodge. It's a time honored tradition of politicians to dodge questions. So they're asked a question and instead they answer something else, right? They're dodging the question. And you see, that's a sort of very basic, regular way in which bullshit that you can identify bullshit is someone actually answering the question? Or, right, maybe more commonly, is the information or thing that that person is saying relevant to what we're talking about? Right? Maybe they're not even trying to answer a question. Maybe it's not even a debate. Maybe it's some other thing, and they're just sort of engaged in diarrhea of the mouth, right? True BS. And what they are effectively doing is dodging the issue. They're dodging the topic that is part of the conversation or the debate or the argument. And I'm using a lot of political examples today, in part because I'm a political sociologist, in part because of what has happened over the last 4 years, in part because it's the presidential election year. But let me, in this case, give an example actually from the corporate world. I think it's a great example of the dodge. I think the dodge is probably the most frequent means of bullshit, and so knowing it is the sort of most common tool you're going to use in identifying bullshit that's out there. So this is this is Tim Cook, head of Apple Computer. And this is at a shareholder meeting in 2014, a couple years ago. And shareholders for Apple were really concerned at the time that iPhone sales were falling off. And because Apple makes the company's revenue is based so heavily on the sale of iPhones, this is a really, really important question about whether or not iPhones will continue to make money for the company over the long haul. And so Tim Cook picks up this graph. Now, can anyone tell what's wrong with this graph? I mean, I've already given you the setup, right? That this is a dodge. But what is dodgy about this information? Do you think Cook is lying? Has he made up these numbers? What's wrong with this picture? Yeah, so Christian nailed it, right? The key word here is cumulative, right? Cumulative over 10 years is not the same as sales per year, as Gary points out. The truth is that the sale of any product is going to look like this over time, because the number can only, if you're looking at cumulative numbers, the number can only go up, right? You don't have sales being removed. And so the point is not that this information is inaccurate, right? And I would go back to the sort of original, like, what is bullshit, what is bias that we talked about at the beginning. Tim Cook is serving up a gigantic steaming pile of bullshit here to some very, very smart shareholders, many of whom are going to eat this bullshit. But he's not lying, right? This information is not inaccurate. It's simply irrelevant, right? The question at hand is, how is iPhone sales doing now in comparison to the past? And actually, someone has revised this picture or superimposed the data that matters onto this exact photograph right here, right? So what the shareholders care about are the small purple things at the bottom, right? That shows how many iPhones are being sold, in this case, every quarter of each year over the last 10 years. And as you can see, right, shareholders did have reasons to be worried at this time, right? Because iPhone sales did not look good. Now, ultimately, one of the things that Apple Computer did, right, is develop new products with large profit margins, like the Apple Watch that they were able to sell to people to sort of make up for the lagging revenues that they've experienced with the iPhone. But if shareholders had let Tim Cook get away with this kind of bullshit, that might never have happened, right? Because he's engaged in a classic dodge by not providing the information that's really the most useful or relevant to the topic at hand. Okay, so let's go back to our methods of identifying bullshit. Let me give you two more. One is emotional baggage. And I think that someone Gary alluded to this a little bit earlier when he said, he knows something is BS if someone is super emphatic about giving it. And that's one example of identifying emotional baggage. Our emotions can be really, really useful to us in identifying friends and foes, identifying what we like and what we dislike. And so, there's really, really good reasons that we should be listening to our kind of emotional responses. We should be attuned to the emotional responses of others. But we should also, and we do that because we recognize how powerful emotions are. But that power, right, like any power, can be used for good or ill. And many times bullshitters are trying to exploit our emotions in order to pull the wool over our eyes, in order to BS us without us necessarily sort of recognizing it. And so when you see appeals to your emotions, right, that doesn't automatically mean that it's BS, but it does mean that your red flag should go up immediately, right? And you should be saying, okay, hold on, this person, right, is using so much emotional language. They are talking, through their sobs or through their excitement. This makes me want to stop and really filter and think through what they're saying to make sure that I'm responding to sort of an actual situation, an actual piece of information, and not just responding to emotional baggage that I might have, or the person who I'm speaking to, the person who's writing the media piece might have. I think that one of the most powerful ways that this kind of BS has been employed in the last few years is through the use of fear. And marketers, both political and economic marketers, have known for a long time that fear sells. Right? People sort of invoking people's fears and anxieties and making them more anxious, making them more fearful, allows you to do a lot of things, allows you to BS in a lot of ways that you wouldn't be otherwise if you weren't able to sort of bring that emotional baggage to the table. And so I think that that's a really good one. Bullshitters like to use our emotions against us, especially fear. I don't want to take up too much time here. So let's move on to the fourth one, which is both Sideism. And if there's any one thing I want you to take away from our hour together today, it would be this. The fact is that most Americans, most people, don't really pay attention to a lot of the information that is sort of bombarding us all the time, right? We live in a 24-hour media environment. We have media constantly, right, in our pockets, in our phones, on our computers. And not only is it there all the time, we're constantly looking at it, right? If you're looking at TikTok, you're looking at BS. If you're looking at Facebook, you're looking at BS. If you're looking at Twitter, you're looking at BS. If you're on Instagram, you're looking at BS. And most of us, most of the time in all of these things, aren't really paying that close attention to what's going on. I don't know if any of you know the old Peanuts cartoons with Snoopy and Charlie Brown and so forth, but those animated cartoons, it was always about the children in those, right? Peanut, Charlie Brown and Lucy and so forth. And anytime adults ever speak in those animated cartoons, all you hear is this. And they're just going, wah, 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 wah. And like I think it's a trombone or something that makes that noise. And the point is, it's just all this sort of adult talk is just all kind of abstract noise to these kids. We've built a new media environment on not paying attention. Twitter, Facebook, all of these things, right? You're going through lots and lots of different things that are completely disconnected from one another, and therefore sort of not spending a lot of time thinking about or being engaged in the issues or the debate and so forth. And in that context, it is just a sort of human reaction to assume that, right, when you see a big argument that you're not particularly invested in, you figure that, yeah, you know, there must be this side, there must be this side. Probably the truth is somewhere in the middle, right? I mean, you know, maybe it's a little this way, maybe it's a little this way, who knows? But, right, that these people are arguing, they're extreme, and so, you know, the truth might be somewhere in the middle. This is called both Sideism because it makes this assumption that basically isn't true, right? Because two sides are arguing does not mean that the truth is somewhere in the middle. Very often, one side is defending the truth and defending facts, and the other is not, right? And by the way, going back to sort of where I started, this then suggests that being unbiased does not mean that you come down here in an argument, right? It means that you have to actually evaluate the information because bullshit is not created equal, right? And it's not always in the middle. And then to sort of circle back to Hannah Arendt and the origins of totalitarianism, sometimes bullshit, right, is being thrown out there, not so that you will believe this side, right? But that at the minimum, that just to prevent you from believing this side. All this bullshit is going out there trying to appeal to your both sideism so that you'll say, meh, you know, this isn't really my issue, must be somewhere here in the middle, instead of the truth that the one side of an argument is saying. Both sideism is really, really important to watch out for. We as human beings can't possibly be engaged in, be interested in, learn all the information about every issue, every concern that might be out there in the world that we might need to form an opinion or make a decision about. And so it's important to recognize that we can't simply assume that the truth or the middle of the road is in the exact center of two different opposing opinions, right? So there's lots of good examples of this. The sort of science deniers who talk about you know, rejecting the science behind climate change is a good example of this. This is not a potato issue where the truth is somewhere in the middle, right? There's science, right? And what is a scientific consensus? And it is admittedly messy and so forth. And then there are those who deny it. And there isn't a space in the middle that sort of, that scientists are sort of right, but the deniers are sort of right. Now, note that that's a different question than what policies we should follow, right? Which there's a legitimate range of political and moral opinions about what we should do about climate change. But the fact of climate change and the scientific consensus around it isn't something where you should sort of take a middle road, because that middle road doesn't exist. It's simply not true. It's a figment of a lot of bullshit that has been produced about this issue. Okay, so that's all well and good. I've given you 4 examples here. By the way, in my class calling bullshit, I go through actually 14 different ways to identify bullshit. So, you know, I'm giving you kind of a subset here of ones I thought might be most useful in this day and age, and also ones that maybe might be less familiar to you. Let's go to the 4th thing that I wanted to do for today, and that is to actually talk about what you can do about BS, right? I mean, what is it, once you see it, like, it's one thing whether you identify it or not, but once you've identified it, what do you do? I think a lot of us feel helpless. We want to shut down. We want to just shut out the news, shut out what's, you know, all of the yelling and all of the arguments. And this is a really, really ineffective way to deal with BS. And it's actually the main reason that I decided to develop this class calling bullshit at Lehigh, because because, as I pointed out earlier, right, using the Hannah Arendt quote, there is the worst kind of, the most insidious, the most dangerous kind of BS is actually designed to get us to do exactly that, right? It is designed to have us not take one side or another, but to simply shut down and not take sides, to stay out of the fight, to stay out of the debate. So the first thing to know about calling out BS, right, is it's really, really important to do this. If you understand what BS is, you need to also call it out. It simply is not a workable solution to kind of shrink back and do nothing. And so I think it's worth sort of developing some ways to do that. And just to give you, I gave you 4 concrete ways to identify BS. I'll give you 4 concrete ways to call out BS as well for the purposes of our hour here. One, and maybe it's just my personality, but one of the ones that I really like is the use of humor, right? And you'll see this in a number of the comedy shows, like The Daily Show, like Full Frontal with Sandra B. What is her name? Samantha Bee. Thank you, Samantha Bee. These are comedy shows. At their core, they're comedy shows, but a lot of what they do is call BS out using jokes. And the jokes allow us to see the BS in a way that perhaps we hadn't seen it before. And it also takes the edge off the unpleasantness of having to deal with BS, off the recognition that there really are people out there trying to BS you, right? And that's not very nice. It's harmful to you. It's harmful to your interests. It's harmful to the larger collective good. And so it can be really unpleasant to have to deal with that BS. Using humor is a way to sort of present it in a socially acceptable way to yourself and to others, a way to reach people that may not know all the different ways to identify bullshit, but a good use of humor and so forth can help call it out. The Socratic Method is another great way to call out BS. And for those of you who don't know, I mean, there's a whole long conversation we could have about what the Socratic Method is and how it works best. But for now, I'll just boil it down to, it's instead of making statements, you ask people questions. And you ask people questions so that they can realize the flaws in their argument or the flaws in the information, rather than you simply telling them this information. So you can ask questions like, well, why do you believe that? How does that relate to this issue? Where did you get that information? How do you see these two things connecting, and so on and so forth? So, the quick and dirty way to talk about the Socratic Method is it's the use of questions rather than use of statements, right? So if you feed me some BS, I could just call you on that BS and say, you're BSing me, right? Or don't BS me, or you're wrong, here's the fact, right? Those things don't tend to work very well. I mean, sometimes you need to do it, but sometimes they don't work very well because, well, number one, for an observer, it becomes a he said, she said, situation. One person says this, one person says this. How do you decide? The other is, if you attack the other person, they're less likely to sort of be open to seeing the sort of reality of the world that you're trying to open to them. And so I think using questions and using the Socratic Method can be really helpful. Now, of course, in most cases, it also requires some goodwill on the part of other people. So this might work better, for example, with friends or with family that are using bullshit than it does people who out in just sort of the general media, because oftentimes, they know they're BSing and they don't really have any interest in hearing the ways in which their BS is being received. So the Socratic Method only works in some circumstances, but it can certainly work well in those circumstances where it applies. I think the other one, and this is one, the use of humor in the Socratic Method, I think you could find these anywhere. One of the ones that I really focus on and have developed in the Calling Bullshit class is the need to call out bullshit with focus and then with empathy. And what I mean by that is, when you get BS from the media, there's an instinct to want to say to your friend, or in a comment on social media, all the ways in which it's wrong, right? All the ways in which it's wrong. It does this, it does this, it does this, it misrepresents this, it lies about this, so on and so forth. And you could be right to do that. But if you're actually trying to have an impact on the amount of BS on the world, it tends not to be a winning strategy for calling out BS. Because when you do all those things, you list the 5 or the 10 reasons that something is BS, other people will only glom on to the weakest argument that you make. So you might have 9 great arguments and 1 weak one, and they're going to say, on social media, they're going to say, oh yeah, but what about this? You said this, but that's not true, right? Instead, when you're calling out BS, what you want to do is focus on the most important piece of it, the one thing. Sometimes that one thing is the most important. Another way to do it is the one that is most obviously BS, the BS that's clearest. And you want to focus attention when you're calling out BS on that one thing, because that avoids people's ability to engage in more BS using the dodge, right? By muddying the waters, by talking at cross purposes, you focus on one thing. Hold on, I'm also trying to admit people from the waiting room here as they come in. I think it's also important to do this with some empathy. You want to try to put yourself in another person's shoes, right? And focus on the issue in a way that does not insult them, does not denigrate their intelligence, doesn't necessarily denigrate their motives. And the reason is simple, right? No one's going to listen to you if you don't act, if you're being a jerk. And you might very well deserve, that person may very well deserve to be told that they're an asshole, right? They very well might be an asshole. But if your goal is to call out BS in a way that they might be able to hear you, and more importantly, if you want to call out BS in ways that other people online or in your family can hear you, having some empathy for people who are spewing BS is often the most useful way to do it. So focus on one thing in the BS and do it with some empathy. And I think that that's the really the most effective kind of thing. Okay, so that's 4 things. Last, I want to leave you with some ideas of where you can learn more about this. And then I want to open it up for questions. So you can go ahead and start posting your questions if you want. This doesn't really fit well on my, in my Zoom picture, but just let me leave you with a couple of things. Number one, Lehigh has a fantastic documentary film that's called Merchants of Doubt. And it talks about how this kind of extraordinary type of bullshit works. Their main focus is on the economy and on big business, not on politics. But it shows that BS is not often about persuasion. It's often just about breaking down that barrier that we try to draw between facts and fiction in ways that are incredibly destructive for our economy, incredibly destructive to our politics, and can really hurt the interests of consumers, of citizens, and so forth. And it's written it's done in an engaging style. So I really recommend that. For those of you who want to learn a little bit more about Hannah Arendt and her work and its applicability to calling bullshit and on the bullshit in the media today, here's a short article on Hannah Arendt and why she matters today that I think could be really useful. There's a great, it's not exactly a graphic novel, but there's a book called The Illustrated Book of Bad Arguments. It's basically a large compendium of all the ways in which you can identify BS and the logical fallacies, the psychological tricks that are used. And it's done in a way with it's big on pictures as well. It's told as like a kid's a picture book online, so you can access it through that site. And then finally, I would encourage you to consider enrolling in my Calling Bullshit course, where we talk a lot about these things in detail. It's going to be offered on a remote synchronous online course in the spring. It'll be Tuesdays and Thursdays from 3 to 4:15. There's the CRN number and a link if you want to learn more information. The syllabus from last spring is there for you to look at. I'm going to make some revisions based on what students have told me and so forth. But there's 4 concrete places that you can go to learn more about this. And so with that, I'll stop. My throat's getting a little raw. I've spoken a lot. I don't think I've heard anyone else speak yet. The responses that people have given in the chat. Do you have questions for me or reactions or things that you want to add to this? Okay, so Margaret asked in the chat about advice on being persuasive with those who have distrust for credible sources. So I don't. I think that's a place where the Socratic method can work really well. You can really zero in on, well, why do you think that this blog post is as credible as NASA? For example, like who's running, well, do you know who runs it? And sort of, well, what did they study? What do they know about these things? How many people are working for that blog? And how many people are working for NASA? What did they do and so forth? If someone has already decided that they're going to push a worldview in which the fact that someone has credentials is by definition disqualifying for them to talk about something, and those people do exist, you're not going to make any headway. But you will make headway for all the people who are listening, right? All the people who are watching that discussion thread and so forth. Because as far gone as it seems we are right now, the reality is that most people and most Americans, they do maintain some respect for expertise. The problem is expertise is harder to see, it's harder to find, and the Socratic method can really help sort of bring that out for people in ways that they don't necessarily sort of see on the surface. So I think that's a great question, Margaret. I'd love to hear if other people have ideas on sort of how you explain to someone that the InfoWars guy on YouTube isn't actually a credible source. So John asks, is omitting or ignoring information a form of BS? Absolutely, yes. I mean, both of the verbs you used, omitting and ignoring, are active, meaning, right, someone made a conscious choice, and so I think that's that's BS without question. It's also true you can see BS that's a little, I guess I would put less strength on motivation. People may have heard of the psychological concept of confirmation bias, which is the tendency in human psychology to kind of be more attentive to things that confirm the worldview that you already have, and have a harder time or more difficult time sort of seeing, much less absorbing and accepting information that challenges your point of view. This will lead people sometimes to focus on some data rather than others. And one of the ways you can protect yourself against being a bullshitter, because let's be honest, I've sort of been painting it as like we're all paragons of virtue here, and we're victims of BS in the media, but we all dish it out as well. And in fact, one of the assignments that I think is one of the most fun and also most revealing assignments in my Calling BS class is students need to take a paper that they've written at Lehigh, or if they haven't written one at Lehigh, somewhere else, and they have to write a new paper describing all the BS that they put in that other paper, and why and how, and was it convincing, and so forth. And it makes you realize just how much BS we're dishing out. in those cases, it can sometimes just be a matter of, if you stop and train yourself to recognize confirmation bias, you become a more active and you know, a better consumer of information. And you know, that's still BS, but you can work at using less BS yourself. But absolutely, if you omit or ignore information, that's BS. Other questions? Doesn't have to be a question, it could be a comment. You could call me out on some of the BS that I've shared today. We can have a discussion about that.
I don't want to say something negative. I actually want to say something very positive. I came in late, but this was a wonderful talk and very, very interesting to listen to with our current world that we live in.
Great. Well, thank you, Declan. I'm sorry. I know you were running a little late, and but I've enjoyed the discussion. My email is on the slide, my video here. And thank you for bearing with me. This is the first time I'm also experimenting with not sharing screen, but actually trying to integrate my presentation into the video. And there were definitely a few little hiccups, but you were guinea pigs for that. So you're welcome to email me. Be happy to sort of learn new faces and so forth on campus to talk about this issue, because there's really more to it than meets the eye, and it's worth some really interesting conversations about what is and what isn't, and how do you know, and things like that. Okay, I think our time is up, and I'm not seeing any more questions. So I wish you all farewell, and thank you for your. I got to put up my other hand. So thank you all for your attention, and good luck calling out bullshit in your lives. All right, bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.